Hi guys, so my paper is titled Feminist Movements, Differences, Contestation, and Social Identity. Although relatively new as a defined movement, women's rights have a long-rooted history in various ideologies and intellectual movements. This has spawned a modern feminist movement rife with different branches, mores, and goals, contributing to tension and differences in identity. Ideological differences in various feminist movements and their historical roots have contributed to contestation within the modern movement as a whole, which has a negative impact on one's social identity within the movement. This paper proceeds as follows: an explanation of contestation and intersectionality in the feminist movement, followed by a discussion of various feminist ideologies and their historical contexts, and a comparison of these ideologies and how their differences have influenced contestation, intersectionality, and social identity in the modern-day movement. So, when examining the different ethics and mores of various feminist movements, one must first understand the tensions that exist in a social group, often known as contestation. Contestation within groups refers to the degree of within-group agreement about the constitutive norms of an identity, consensus and congruence of the social purposes ascribed to an identity, and coherence of shared cognitive models. When these norms and goals are not agreed upon, members and group identity will be fragmented into conflicting and potentially inconsistent understandings of what the group's purposes or relations should be. Contestation has always been an issue when discussing the various branches of the feminist movement. So feminist scholars from different branches, like liberal, Marxist, radical, etc., often critique other feminist ideologies. The root of the contestation usually pertains to intersectionality in the movement. A somewhat loose and theoretical concept first coined by feminist scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, intersectionality dictates that different dimensions of social life, so hierarchies, axes of differentiation, axes of oppression, social structures, normativities, are intersecting, mutually modifying, and inseparable, and these fuse to create unique experiences and opportunities for all groups. So early forms of feminism and some aspects of the movement today overlook these intersections, as some feminist scholars sought to isolate gender oppression from other forms of oppression. So consequently, their work tended to be either preoccupied with the experiences of white middle-class women or to ignore completely the experiences of other women. This begat criticism from feminist scholars who live on more than one axis of oppression. It is from this criticism that the development and articulation of intersectionality began to take shape. So feminist scholars with varying frames of reference and mores tend to agree that if there is no unified group of women that experience gender discrimination in some way, it makes no sense to treat sexism or racism or homophobia, etc., as if they could be isolated. The next sections will explore different branches of feminism and how their specific goals and ideologies contribute to this problem of contestation within the feminist movement. So the earliest feminist ideology is known as liberal feminism. Feminist scholar Alison Jagger, in her work Feminist Politics and Human Nature, wherein she describes various forms of feminism, writes that liberal feminism focuses on public equality, specifically that of education, workplace rights, and political participation. With regards to the private sphere, liberal feminists focused on how private inequality impedes public equality. For example, marriages should involve partnerships, not submissive power dynamics, because that will impede public equality. The goal is gender equality in the public sphere with equal access to education, equal pay, ending job sex segregation, better working conditions, all won primarily through legal changes. Liberal feminism relies on the power of the state to gain political rights, evidenced by the champions of the Equal Rights Amendment and like legislation. So in liberal feminism, the root of gender inequality is women's exclusion from the public sphere of work and politics, and feminism should promote women's entry into the public sphere by facilitating or at least removing obstacles to their labor market participation. So liberal feminism has its strongest roots in the writing of feminist scholar Mary Wollstonecraft. Published in 1972, Wollstonecraft's observation of the political upheavals of the French and American revolutions partly inspired her seminal work, A Vindication of the Rights of Women. Wollstonecraft laid the foundation for modern liberal feminist movements in her work. Her work champions women's public equality with men, equal access to education, and greater political participation. Wollstonecraft contends that with education and public equality, women will quickly become wise and virtuous as men become more so. She also writes that this improvement must be mutual, or the injustice which one half of the human race are obliged to submit to, retorting on their oppressors, the virtue of men will be worm-eaten by the insect, woman, whom he keeps under his feet. So Wollstonecraft relies on the power of the state and society to enact change, using women as gender as the unit of analysis in her work. The inequality women face is due to their gender and society's view thereof. Wollstonecraft's ideas, although old, influenced one of the strongest branches of feminism. And despite its publication in the late 1700s, Wollstonecraft's ideas did not receive much positive use until over half a decade later. The feminist movement began in modernity in the mid-1800s with the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, wherein women and women's rights activists gathered for the first time to discuss social, civil, and religious condition and the rights of women. After this, the movement gave momentum throughout the 1800s and early 1900s, with women such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and later Carrie Chapman Chadd and Alice Paul running organizations such as the National American Women's Suffrage Association to campaign for women's suffrage and other rights. This is liberal feminism at its core, as upper white-class women campaigned for state action to increase public equality for women. Early feminists looked to Wollstonecraft's writing for inspiration in their movement, and these early movements were revolutionary in that they made great headway in the fight for gender equality. However, these movements did focus primarily on white upper middle-class women, causing women of color, such as Sojourner Truth, to campaign concurrently, yet separately, for the rights of colored women. This rift continued throughout the 1800s to the point where white suffragists such as Stanton expressed anger and dismay over the passing of the 15th Amendment before the 19th. So even in its earliest stages, the feminist movement has experienced contestation. So in contrast to liberal feminism, one of the other kinds of feminism we talked about in class, Marxist feminism, which emerged in the early 1900s, is characterized by a different ideology. So while women are still the unit of analysis, Marxist feminist scholars conceptualize their oppression as class oppression in addition to gender discrimination. Here, the oppressions of gender and the oppressions of class intersect on a multi-axial approach, unlike that of liberal feminism. So the root issue here is not simply gender inequality, but class struggle and the failings of a capitalist system in which oppressed women operate. In Marxist feminist theory, gender is not the exclusive basis of oppression. Rather, scholars hold and continue to hold that class and gender are symbiotic, at least to some degree, and one cannot be addressed without taking the other into consideration. So like liberal feminists, Marxist feminists seek equality of the sexes, yet do not believe that that is entirely possible with the constraints of a current capitalist society. So Marxist and socialist feminisms, like liberal feminism, has a long history, and intersectionality or lack thereof within the movements continued to be a cause of contestation throughout the 1900s inside and outside the United States. As early as 1905, Socialist Party leader Eugene Debs and Susan B. Anthony were at odds, each of them supporting a different end of the feminist spectrum. Outside the United States, Marxists such as Alexandra Kollontai championed the Marxist feminist movement. A prominent member of the Russian revolutionaries of 1917 and onward, Kollontai drew on the Marxist ideology of the time to become an early and vital Marxist feminist scholar. Kollontai asserts strongly that specific economic factors are behind the subjugation of women and that natural qualities have been a secondary factor in the process. So an advocate of Marxist revolution, Kollontai believed that women could become truly free and equal in a world only organized along new social and productive lines. In addition, Kollontai was an early critic of liberal feminism, writing of her bourgeoisie feminist counterparts that feminists seek equality in the framework for an existing class society, and in no way do they attack the basis of this society. They fight for prerogatives for themselves without challenging the existing prerogatives and privileges. We do not accuse the representatives of the bourgeoisie's women's movement of failure to understand their matter. Their view of things flows inevitably from their class position. So decades before intersectionality even joined the feminist lexicon, Kollontai was an example of contestation and critique of existing feminist ideology, which is an issue that still pervades the modern movement. So as mentioned before, intersectionality remains at the heart of feminist contestation. After the passing of the 19th Amendment and into the mid-1900s, feminists such as Margaret Sanger and Betty Friedan emerged with the second wave of feminism, campaigning for a woman's right to be treated equally with men on both a cultural and institutional level. Friedan founded the National Women's Organization, one of the largest women's organizations in the country. However, the organization had issues with intersectionality from the outset, excluding queer women. And in the realm of Marxist feminism, decades after Kollontai criticizes liberal feminism, Gloria Steinem suggested that women, and particularly younger women, were eager to throw their support behind socialist Bernie Sanders rather than female candidate Hillary Clinton. This suggestion became evident in the 2016 national election when Sanders won 53% of the female vote in the New Hampshire primary, in contrast to Clinton's 46%. So many Marxist feminists still criticize the feminism advocated by Clinton, as well as many middle-class American women, as singularly white and rich. As feminism continues to progress into today's movement, queer women, poor women, and women of color become a more mainstream membership, yet the movement today still faces contestation and cohesion issues with respect to intersectionality. So today's liberal feminist movements, such as the Women's March and the Pantsuit Nation, experience contestation and critique regarding creating political spaces of inclusion versus those that often work to exclude. This contestation over the importance and inclusion of intersectionality in the feminist agenda has caused member disillusionment as the feminist movement experiences a lack of cohesion and an increase in fracture. So, contestation within the feminist ideology has massive potential to be damaging to the goals and achievements of the entire movement. Intersectionality with respect to the feminist movement has always been championed by the more marginalized members of the group, such as poor women, such as Alexandra Kollontai, queer women and women of color, who could never restrict their campaign to a single axis of differentiation or to a single aspect of inequality, since for these members, racial, sexual, heterosexual, and class oppression are interlocking. The feminist movement, specifically the liberal feminist movement, has often had trouble thinking on multiple axes of differentiation, perhaps due to a deep anxiety traceable in the reception of and debates about intersectionality that have arisen into the wider community of feminist scholarship. The tensions between different groups of feminist scholarship have led to a lack of cohesion in the movement, which causes problems for those who identify as feminists as they try to form their own feminist social identity in a movement that is fractured. If the movement is not cohesive, this movement will lose power as a whole. So the question then arises as to how to simultaneously hold on to a radical and a contingent account of knowledge claims and knowing subjects while maintaining solidarity across differences among women in the time of a long-term or wide-ranging feminist movement. So while contestation and criticism are important in increasing the power of the marginalized voice, cohesion in the feminist ideology is critical for the power and the longevity of the movement.